The central theme embedded within the 1888 documentation concerning what the Cherokee said about the healing cathedrals that stood before is the foundational principle that true healing is inseparable from the restoration of harmony and balance within the cosmos, a concept intrinsically linked to the places where this spiritual equilibrium was most potent. These cathedrals, understood not as European stone structures but as sacred landscapes, mountaintops, river bends, and the ancient town of Kituwah, were considered the very nexus points of the universe's life force, where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was at its thinnest. For the Cherokee, health was not merely the absence of physical ailment but a state of being in correct relationship with all living things, a condition described as diyukta, or the white path of balance and harmony. Straying from this path, whether through transgression, disrespect, or spiritual contamination, was understood to be the root cause of illness, a sickness that manifested in the individual but originated in a fractured social or spiritual order. The cathedrals, as these natural sanctuaries, were therefore places of pilgrimage and ritual, designed not for worship in a congregational sense, but for the profound act of reconnecting with the source of life and order. The most significant of these natural cathedrals were the rivers, referred to in Cherokee cosmology as the long man or long person, a living, breathing entity imbued with spirit and medicine. The ritual of going to water, frequently documented by ethnographers like James Mooney, was a primary act of healing, wherein the afflicted would stand at the water's edge at dawn, facing the east from which life and hope originated, to ritually cleanse themselves. This was a symbolic rebirth and a realignment with the flow of the universe, a practice so central that it was observed that the Cherokee were Baptists before there were any Baptists, underscoring the ancient tradition of water as a purifying and regenerative force. Furthermore, the record of the divining stone, or divining crystal, kept by the great medicine men, illustrates that the spiritual power concentrated in these sacred sites was also accessible through consecrated objects, as these stones, placed where water could work up into their hollows, served as miniature cathedrals, a microcosm of the healing power found in the broader landscape. The 1888 accounts and subsequent scholarship clarify that the Cherokee understood a holistic and relational universe. Their healing cathedrals were the sites where that interconnectedness was most tangible, where the sick could be re-socialized and reintegrated into the community, and where the proper, reciprocal relationships with the spirit world and the environment could be meticulously restored through ceremony and prayer. This ancient perspective fundamentally redefines the concept of a cathedral, from a building to a living, dynamic geography of power, memory, and spiritual renewal. The second key point from the documented Cherokee understanding of the healing cathedrals is the remarkable resilience and adaptive continuity of these sacred traditions, which were not lost or replaced by colonial contact but rather transformed and concealed within new frameworks, ensuring their survival into the present day. The 1888 documentation and subsequent ethnographic studies reveal that the belief systems and practices centered on these spiritual landscapes and the medicine councils that operated within them did not simply vanish with the arrival of European religions. Instead, the Cherokee people demonstrated a profound capacity for cultural synthesis, blending their ancient understandings of health and healing with the introduced Christian faith in ways that allowed the core principles of their medicine to endure. This syncretism was not a sign of cultural surrender but a strategic and deeply meaningful adaptation. James Mooney's fieldwork in the late 1880s, which forms the basis of the healing cathedrals concept, recorded that respected Cherokee curers, who were the keepers of the knowledge tied to these sacred sites, simultaneously served as Methodist preachers, seeing no inherent conflict between their traditional role and Christian ministry. This early documentation of compatibility illustrates that the underlying philosophy, that healing required a connection to a higher, spiritual power and the restoration of balance, was seen as a universal truth that could be expressed through different cultural idioms. This adaptive process continued into the mid-20th century, where in Oklahoma Cherokee communities, it was common for many staunch Baptists, including ministers, to also practice as native doctors, praying to both the Christian God and the thunder, a powerful spiritual being in Cherokee cosmology, to cure disease. The very fabric of their spiritual life was interwoven, as Christian hymns sung in the Cherokee language became integrated into traditional ritual practices, considered as sacred as the ancient songs sung at the stomp grounds. A poignant example of this blending is found in a 1963 account of a healing service at a Christian campground, where a medicine man and a minister worked collaboratively, the minister praying silently while the medicine man led the congregation in a stirring rendition of Amazing Grace. This was not a case of one tradition superseding the other, but of the medicine man's role and the collective, communal nature of healing being expressed through an adopted form. The most profound evidence of this continuity, however, is the documented transformation of the Sacred Fire organization into the structure of the Cherokee Baptist Church. Ethnographic work in the 1970s detailed a community where, following a severe drought that traditional medicine councils failed to resolve through their usual collective practices, a switching over occurred. The head of the medicine council converted to Christianity, and the church adopted the council's core function, responsibility for the well-being of the entire community. The church formed a new, 7-member nominating committee, a number that mirrored the 7 members of the medicine council and likely represented the 7 Cherokee clans. This committee took over the traditional role of public and private curing ceremonies, including practices like the laying on of hands, demonstrating that the institutional structure and the very meaning of communal healing were being preserved, simply reclothed in the language and organization of the Baptist faith. This adaptive process was not a loss but a reinvention, allowing the ancient, collective purpose of the healing cathedrals and their councils to survive when the original social and political structures were no longer viable. The Cherokee healers continued their tradition of working together, constantly monitoring and incorporating new knowledge while preserving the conservative goal of maintaining diyukta, harmony and balance, for the community, showing that the spirit of the healing cathedrals was carried forward through any vessel that could hold it. The third key point embedded within the 1888 documentation is the profound understanding that the healing power of these cathedrals was not an impersonal or automatic force, but was instead contingent upon the strict adherence to ritual precision, communal participation, and the moral purity of both the healer and the patient. The Cherokee believed that the spiritual energy concentrated in these sacred landscapes could be accessed, but only through correct procedures that had been handed down since the beginning of time, and any deviation from these prescribed rituals could render the ceremony ineffective or even dangerous. The medicine men and women who served as intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world were not simply practitioners of herbal remedies, but were keepers of sacred formulas and songs that had to be recited without a single error, for the very words themselves were believed to carry intrinsic power that could compel the spirit beings to act on behalf of the afflicted. This oral tradition was preserved with meticulous care, as the loss or mispronunciation of a single syllable was thought to break the connection to the healing forces of the cathedrals, leaving the patient vulnerable to the malevolent influences that had caused their illness in the first place. Furthermore, the success of the healing ceremony depended not only on the healer's knowledge and ritual purity but also on the patient's sincerity and their willingness to confess any transgressions they had committed against the spiritual order or the community, as illness was frequently understood to be a consequence of moral failure or broken relationships. The patient's preparation for the ritual, which often involved fasting, isolation, and introspection, was considered as vital as the ceremony itself, and their participation was an active contribution to the restoration of balance rather than a passive reception of treatment. The community, too, played a crucial role in the healing process, as their collective presence and their shared belief in the efficacy of the ritual created a supportive environment that reinforced the patient's connection to the social fabric and the spiritual world. The documented accounts of the healing cathedrals emphasize that these were not solitary experiences but deeply communal events, where the entire village would gather to witness the ceremony, to offer their prayers, and to reaffirm their own commitment to the values that sustained harmony within their society. This communal dimension was essential, for an individual's health was inseparable from the health of the group, and the restoration of one person's well-being was simultaneously a reaffirmation of the entire community's relationship with the sacred geography of their ancestral lands. The 1888 observations recorded that the Cherokee approached these healing sites with a profound sense of reverence and responsibility, recognizing that their spiritual inheritance was both a gift and a burden that demanded constant vigilance, discipline, and mutual accountability, ensuring that the ancient cathedrals continued to serve their purpose as conduits of life-giving power. The fourth key point derived from the 1888 documentation concerns the intrinsic and indissoluble connection between the healing cathedrals and the ancestral lands themselves, a bond that meant the power of these sacred sites was not transferable or replicable elsewhere, making their physical preservation essential to the Cherokee identity and spiritual survival. The documented accounts make it clear that the Cherokee did not view these cathedrals as mere locations of convenience or aesthetic beauty, but as living entities that were imbued with the memories, spirits, and the very breath of their ancestors who had inhabited those spaces for countless generations. Each mountain, each river bend, and each ancient town site like Kituwah was understood to possess a unique spiritual signature, a distinct medicine that could only be accessed at that specific place, because the spirits of the departed, the little people, and the thunder beings had established their presence there through eons of interaction with the Cherokee people. This geographic specificity meant that the healing ceremonies performed at these sites were not generic rituals that could be transported to new settlements or foreign lands, but were deeply contextual acts that drew their potency from the accumulated spiritual energy of that particular landscape, energy that had been cultivated through centuries of prayer, song, and sacrifice. The forced removal of the Cherokee along the Trail of Tears was therefore not merely a political and humanitarian catastrophe, but a profound spiritual dislocation that severed the people from the very sources of their healing and identity, as the cathedrals that had sustained them were left behind to be occupied by settlers who had no understanding of their sacred significance. The 1888 records, compiled just a few decades after this removal, reveal a people who were still grappling with this loss, attempting to recreate their ceremonial practices in Oklahoma while fully aware that the new landscape, however beautiful, lacked the specific spiritual resonance of their ancestral homelands. This awareness is poignantly reflected in the persistence of stories and songs that reference the old places, the rivers and mountains of the Southeast, which continued to be invoked in healing ceremonies as a way of maintaining a spiritual connection across the vast distance, a form of long-distance prayer that acknowledged the enduring power of those lost cathedrals even when the people could no longer physically stand within them. The documented testimonies emphasize that the healing power was not simply a matter of ritual knowledge that could be carried in the mind, but was fundamentally tied to the physical earth itself, to the specific stones, the particular waters, and the unique plant life that grew only in those regions, all of which had been created together in a cosmic order that could not be replicated by human effort. This understanding placed a profound moral obligation upon the Cherokee to protect whatever fragments of their sacred geography remained accessible, and it also explained the intense grief and spiritual disorientation that accompanied their exile, for without the cathedrals, the full spectrum of healing was simply unavailable, leaving the people to adapt as best they could with the diminished resources of a foreign land, always remembering and longing for the places where the spirits of their ancestors still dwelt, waiting patiently for their return.